Talking about why some people get PPS and why other people who had paralytic polio apparently do not, which is a really interesting question, and there is no known reason for this yet. I can only hypothesize, but based on evidence and scientific articles published in peer-reviewed journals, Eddie Bolenbach and I together have kind of developed a hypothesis. So it's probably easiest to explain if you take three people, arbitrarily three people, who get acute polio. So we're talking now back in the time when the polio virus was circulating. So one person gets polio, and the polio virus is what's called a lytic virus, which means that when it infects the cell, it multiplies within that cell until the cell bursts and dies and bursts, or bursts and dies. I guess it actually bursts first and then it dies. But in other words, it kills the cell by causing it to explode, get rid of all the virus. Then the virus leaves that cell, moves on to the adjoining cells, infects those. They produce more virus till they blow up with too much virus inside of them and they die, and then so on and so forth. And so you get this continuing invasion of virus cell to cell to cell. And this is what produces paralysis, because as the cells died, of course, all those are the cell bodies in the anterior horn of the spine. So all the processes which lead to the muscles in whatever area of the body, they innervate, they die, there's no longer any messages being sent to the muscles, and paralysis results. Now, there's a really interesting thing that happens, because the poliovirus is an enterovirus, and enteroviruses are famous for their ability to mutate, and this is what they do best. They mutate in order to survive in a new environment. Now, the poliovirus mutated in each cell that it infected. In most cases, the mutations did nothing unusual. Sometimes they made something called a defective interfering particle, which is a virus that actually could not be infective. Other times, though, one or two of the viruses would mutate such that instead of causing the cell to burst, they could remain viable in the cell, which means that when that virus infected the next cell, rather than producing more of itself until the cell blew up and died, maybe only a few copies were produced of the virus, and they stayed inside that cell, and that cell lived. Now, we don't really know how the virus looks in those cells. It might be a fragment of the virus, because that's been seen, or it could even be the whole virus that's still intact. But most likely it's just a portion of the virus that remains. Okay, so now let's go back to these three people that got polio. So the first person got polio. The virus infected the cells. Some of them burst. A few of them died. But the immune system kicked in before there was enough death to cause paralysis. So this person may have had some muscle weakness, or maybe didn't even notice that, and that would be the case of non-paralytic polio, where they actually had spinal cord involvement, but it was not, the virus did not replicate sufficiently to cause paralysis. But it did replicate enough to mutate and to go into an adjoining cell, infect that cell, and that cell survived, carrying with it the little bit of the poliovirus. So there's a person who had non-paralytic polio, grew up, survived, never had any real indication that they'd had polio, but are carrying these little fragments of the virus. In the second person, the virus infects the cells, some of the cells die, enough cells die to produce paralysis before the immune system kicks in. Excuse me. So that person also had the virus mutate to the point that some of the cells, adjoining the ones that did die, contained little bits of the virus, enough small fragments of the virus, but they don't impair the function of the cell. The cell can still function as a normal neuron. But that person would have had significant paralysis in some area of the body. So they grow up. And the third person also had the same sort of situation where they got infected with the poliovirus. Poliovirus killed enough cells so that they wound up with paralysis. And the mutation that occurred in the poliovirus was not of the type that allowed that virus to remain in a living cell. mutation is a funny thing. There's no predicting how the mutation is going to occur. That some mutations are more likely than others, just because of the structure of the viral genome, but you can't really predict. So in this case, the person had paralytic polio, but there's no cells remaining in that person's body that have little fragments of the polio virus. Okay, so what happens 30 years later? So 30 years later, we revisit the same 3 people. Each one, of course, stands for a whole group of people. They're not just one person. So we revisit the same 3. And we find that people who had non-paralytic polio are coming down with new muscle weakness and fatigue out of proportion to effort expended. And they have no idea why. Or they may have been diagnosed with polio, but it's so long ago in their history that they really don't understand what's happening. In the second case, we have people who had paralytic polio who are now developing new muscle weakness in areas often that they hadn't realized were affected in the first place, developing severe fatigue, new pain, all of these things, and they, at least now, are fortunate enough to understand that there is a label given to this called post-polio syndrome, and there are now lots of groups where people can get more information about this. So these people, in one way, are the most lucky because they actually have a diagnosis of polio. Post-polio PPS syndrome has been publicized now to the point that people understand that it's there. So these people can go to PPS groups for more information. And the third person, the third group, they had polio, but they don't have PPS. What's the difference? Why do some people who had acute polio, had paralytic polio, 30 years later really are no worse off or no better off than they were at the height of their best recovery after they recovered from acute polio? What's the difference? The hypothesis is that the difference is the presence or absence of those little viral fragments remaining within the cells of people who had polio. Now, the first thing to know is that those cells are not infective, those virus bits are not infective. Nobody is going to pass polio to anybody else. You cannot even pass polio to should you be a woman who has a child or becomes pregnant with a child, you cannot pass those polio fragments to even a fetus that you're carrying. They are in no way infective. But, okay, so what do? Well, I mean, they're sitting there, they're going to do something. Everything that's sitting in your body does something. Well, the best guess is that these little fragments are capable of causing subacute chronic inflammation. That is, that the little bits of the virus occasionally get out of the cells. How? Okay, well, there's numerous mechanisms where they could get out, but let's just leave that in the area of mystery for the time being. We could go into that, but that's, of course, in virology and cell biology. They can, in fact, though, leave the cell and be seen by the patrolling immune system, because your body constantly has an immune system on patrol. There are cells, macrophages and other cells, whose sole function is to march around your body looking for inflammation that shouldn't be there, or causes of inflammation, foreign particles, foreign bodies, viruses, bacteria, molds, fungi, things like this, things that shouldn't be in your body. So their sole job is to spot them and set up the alarm. So, okay, so we'll go back to these 2 people who have little bits of virus left in them, the polio virus fragments get out, macrophage sees it, sets up an alarm, says, whoa, polio virus, send in the troops. So the whole immune system can be mobilized, entirely or partly, to combat this, what is perceived to be an infection. Of course, it's not an infection. And as soon as the troops arrive, they go, whoa, well, there's nobody here, because there's one little tiny fragment, and the first guy saw it and got rid of it. So there's nobody there. So now what? Okay, nobody here. What do? Well, we stand down. And the virus, the immune system slowly turns itself off, or not off, but lowers its level of activity. And the inflammation subsides until the next time that one is released. Now, we don't know at what rate they're released, but we can speculate that they could be released at a reasonably regular interval. which would keep the body in a constant state of subacute but chronic inflammation. That's the nutshell of how you could get a subacute chronic inflammation from the polio virus. Now, the really nasty thing is, of course, you can get it from 100 other things as well. And it isn't just one thing. And so for PPS, it seems to me that the idea here is to lower your level of inflammation. That's the key factor. And after you've learned all the other stuff about how to live with PPS, how to use new aids to prevent stressing weak muscles, how to pace to prevent yourself from becoming overly fatigued, after you've learned all this and implemented it, there remains still things that you can use to improve your life. And all of those involve reducing inflammation. And there are many, many tricks to reducing inflammation, many, many things you can do. Some of them you can do nothing about. For instance, the constant release of these little viral fragments, should that be happening, there's nothing you can do to stop that. But what you can do is to minimize the inflammation from other areas that you can control, because everything is additive. And so for all those years when you didn't really have overt PPS, when you really didn't have the new muscle weakness and you really didn't have the incredible fatigue, those virus fragments were still being released, but other levels of inflammation were lower. So as we age, we start pulling in inflammation from many possible areas in our lives. So you have to attack those and get them back. And in that way you can improve your level of, your quality of life. So in PPS, one of the problems is the overextension of these little neuronal processes. There are simply too many for the neuronal body to support. That's one of the problems. But one of the other problems is that these little processes, the neuronal processes, and in fact all neuronal junctions, muscle junctions, are in a constant state of attaching to the muscle and detaching from the muscle. This is just the way it works. This is how the process works. So when the little neuronal sprouts are attached to the muscle gets the message and it can contract. When they're not attached, it can't get the message, it cannot contract, and therefore it's perceived as weak. Inflammation directly relates to the length of time that the little neuronal sprout is in contact with the muscle. When there are inflammatory messengers floating around in the body, in that area, they cause the neuronal process to detach. And so it's detached for longer because they're there. They won't reattach while they're there. And there's more weakness. So this is how inflammation relates, or one of the ways that inflammation relates to new muscle weakness. If you lower the level of inflammation, you lower the time that there's the stuff floating around, and you increase the time that the neuronal sprout is attached to the muscle. Therefore, you increase the muscle strength. More time off, weaker muscle, more time on, stronger muscle. Inflammation, off, weaker muscle, lower your inflammation, longer time on, stronger muscle. Lower your inflammation.
Do you think polio survivors are then generally funded in proportion to their specific needs?
I'm guessing not quite. And that's just because many polio survivors don't advocate for themselves. There are things that they could use and probably need, but they're reluctant to use them because they've always been on their own. They might be struggling up the steps, but I've done this, I can do this, I don't want to be crippled, so on. They don't recognize that using things that are pretty much readily available through government funding or private funding, people have worked all their life, they have some, will make their life so much easier. They will enjoy it so much more. But they're reluctant because they remember from childhood they had to wear a brace. As soon as they were old enough to make the decision, I'm not going to wear that brace anymore, and they chuck it. But now they're getting weaker, and their leg joints are breaking down because their gait is all crooked, and they can use a brace, or they can use a wheelchair, or a scooter, or something to assist. But no, I'm not to that point yet.
I think one of the big questions hidden in there is how much of the mood changes relate to brain damage from polio, how much of it is post-polio syndrome, as opposed to people grappling with a significant and progressive disability, where anybody would get depressed, have mood changes, which would then affect their overall functioning. I think the impact of the post-polio physiology on mood-related centers, again, has not been fully explored. It is suspected that with the immune theory of post-polio, which is certainly a component of post-polio syndrome, that some of the immune chemicals, the cytokines that are being, released and, causing, fatigue, can also contribute to depression. It's been seen in the MS community, where cytokines are also actively involved. So I think there could be a basic pathophysiology that makes people at greater risk to develop mood-related problems. Fatigue, sleep problems, progressive disability, psychosocial issues in general can all add to that. I find that, when I'm trying to treat somebody whose mood is, interfering with treatment or interfering with their lives, I often have to involve a mental health professional. Many insurances have mental health coverage. Many insurances have very limited mental health coverage. Some have no mental health coverage. And you sometimes have to go to bat and really justify why you think this type of intervention is important, why use of antidepressants and how to choose antidepressants is going to be an important thing to assess in these patients. I think one of the most overlooked causes of fatigue is depression, and the other most overlooked cause is sleep problems. Some thought that the prevalence of post-polio, this was, I think, presented at, either at the Warm Springs Conference or one of the neurology meetings, that the prevalence of post-polio in the United States reflects the aggressive rehab that people got after their acute polio, stimulating, nerve muscle connectivity, stimulating, partially damaged nerves to grow back and to hook up to more muscles, creating a setting that was ripe for post-polio as those recovered motor units, those fragile motor units, declined, over the years. In places where that type of aggressive rehab was not available, the incidence of post-polio, and specifically this was somebody from India who was presenting this, much lower. Obviously the residua from the acute polio were much greater, but because there was so little recovery, at least in part because they got so little rehab, or maybe the strain of polio they were experiencing, so little recovery that there wasn't much left to decline in later years.
Okay.
So it's almost like post-polio is an iatrogenic disease. But when I ask people, would you have given up those 30 years of walking? They say no. No way.
I think it's fair to say that that most of the patients that we see, at least, are overachievers. I mean, they are used to just going above and beyond, and they set a goal and they're going to make it. And so it's a pretty driven population, which is very nice from the standpoint of compliance. When they set a goal and they agree that they're going to do something, they move forward and they do it. I think that every characteristic that anyone can look at that they see as an asset in their personality can also, in another situation, be a problem. And so that same kind of mentality makes it a bit difficult for some of these individuals to follow through, for example, on doing some peaceful relaxation before getting into bed. They're go, 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 sleep, get up, go, 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 go. And that might work through one's younger years, but when you start to get older, and start to develop other issues, and then it's the sleep that starts to get eaten away. And so that's a basic part of sleep hygiene, is really going to bed in a relaxed, peaceful state. And that's kind of hard for some of these individuals to do, to kind of back up and relax.
In my experience, they often were extremely frustrated by the time they found us. Many had been misdiagnosed or had their cases mishandled in one way or another, most often dealing with people who really had absolutely no knowledge of post-polio syndrome, even though their names may be listed somewhere, where they might think that they did. So, people came to us after undergoing tests that were unnecessary, surgeries sometimes that may not have been necessary, and by the time they found us, they were so frustrated but also so incredibly relieved to know from the first phone call that they had found a clinic that really understands polio, and that's our focus. I think that it was extremely gratifying for them to just know that we existed and that finally there was a resource and someone who could actually help them. We have a psychologist here. Some people find that extremely helpful, to meet with a psychologist who really comprehends the extremely complex issues that polio survivors are coping with, which is particularly true for somebody who may have just understood for the first time that what they're dealing with actually is post-polio. Some people are told it's old age, or that they're crazy, or that must be some neurological condition that there's no name for, or they have chronic fatigue syndrome or what have you. So the psychological piece is a really important one, and it's something that every member of the polio team has some training on. Not that we're all psychologists, certainly that is not the case, but we all are well aware of what it was like to be a child during the polio epidemics, and to be taken away from your family and put in isolation. And for some people, depending on where they lived, their parents could be 5-hour drive away, and this is before we had major highways, and it was a very difficult time for a lot of kids that had polio and a lot of families, and kind of bringing all that back when we were fitting somebody for a new brace, or even suggesting that they need a brace. There's a lot that the clinicians are dealing with, in addition to the actual physical piece of the new weakness and the need for a brace.
And also the non-paralytic polio folks, it's like 2 to 1. Non-paralytic, non-clinically apparent polio, this flu-like, might feel crummy, stiff neck thing, versus obvious muscle weakness or paralysis. Well, there were 2 studies, one in Los Angeles and one in New York, where these guys went through the polio wards and saw these non-paralytic kids and young adults, teenagers, and said, I'm not so sure about this non-paralytic thing. And they did manual muscle testing, and they found that about 40% of the ones who were diagnosed as non-paralytic had obvious muscle weakness. And if you got them up and walked them, you could see that they were not walking normally. So, during the height of the epidemics, if you could breathe, you went home. And when the epidemics were sort of middling, well, if you could move and looked okay, then you could go home, or you come into the hospital for a night and then you go back home. Mm-hmm. So again, we don't know how many people had severe damage, and the bottom line is that there is this spectrum from having the virus and having it do absolutely no damage to your central nervous system, or not even getting into your central nervous system, through minor damage, through you're dead. Mm. And that's what polio really is, not the non-paralytic versus the paralytic. Mm. And it's a kind of reprogramming, because these polio kids, polio teenagers, even the polio adults, as the years went on, the average age of the person who got polio got older and older, and nobody knows to this day why that's true. But regardless of how old you were when you got polio, these folks literally were brainwashed, you know. The March of Dimes posters were all over, you know, don't let your child become a cripple, join the March of Dimes, help us find the vaccine, the cure for polio. So, you know, they should have been vaccinated, you know, even in the 1930s when there wasn't a vaccine. If they weren't vaccinated, then once the vaccine came out and they got it, it should have cured them. Well, it doesn't work that way. It prevents you from getting polio. It doesn't cure the polio. So no matter how these people look at it, they messed up. You know, they did something wrong. They're wrong. There's something wrong about them. They go have, some of our patients have had 15, 20 surgeries. You know, and a lot of them say, well, you know, the surgeries were for the doctors, not for us. They wanted to train and, you know, screw around and see if this or that worked. We never recommend surgery for polio folks now. You can take a piece of plastic, make a very nice lightweight brace, or the new composite materials. You don't need to fuse the ankle. You know, the polio folks have had enough pain without going back and having more polio surgery.
You don't think that there's any time where some kind of surgery can be a positive intervention? For example, Jill's had surgery on her ankle, and you found that beneficial?
I did.
Yeah.
But I understand what you're saying. Try the other things first. But for me, it didn't work because the foot had twisted around, and because of post-polio, I only had 2 now strong muscles on the inside, nothing elsewhere.
And you can't, well, one of the rules is you can't correct with a brace for a, quote, deformity.
Yeah,
And if your foot is that turned, we actually had a guy come in last week, and we treat people from all over the world. He was from Guatemala. And his foot was exactly like yours. And that's probably the second time in 25 years that we said, you know what, we can't correct this deformity. You know, if we put you in a brace, it's going to hurt like hell because it's just going to force the foot.
Work.
No, it's not going to work. So, you know, 2
There
patients.
are the odd occasion.
Yeah, 2 patients out of, you know, 6,000 or 7,000, you know, isn't bad in terms of that.
But that's probably a good way of looking at it, where there's deformity. So that's when surgery can perhaps correct. But where there's just weakness.
Right. I'll leave you with a scary statistic. Back probably 95, we looked at all of the patients that we treated, and about 12% of them either came to the evaluation and we talked about what they needed to do with assistive devices and changing their lifestyle, and they either told me to go to hell and would not come back. Several people have told me that they would rather commit suicide than use a cane and go back to where they were and be physically, emotionally, and sexually abused because they had polio and they were easy marks. Some of them started the program and couldn't take it, you know, which is one of the reasons we're not in the hospital anymore, that we're in a separate building so they don't have to go to the hospital. So 12% of these folks just hit the road. And for 10 years, none of them came back. And about 10 years later, we started to see these people come back. And the ones that walked in came back with crutches. The ones who were on crutches originally came back in wheelchairs. And here's the scary thing, which shows you how much of a head game this polio is and how hard it is to reboot polio survivors. 80% of the people who slid all the way down this slippery slope from walking to wheelchairs told me to go to hell again and left and have never come back. In the US, and I don't know what the stats are for Australia, but it's probably staggered because England also is staggered. The vaccine came out April 1955. And, you know, again, I don't think this is unusual. People thought that, well, polio was over April 12, 1955. In 1959, there were 10,000 cases of polio in the United States. there were congressional hearings led by a congressman who had polio, asking, where is the vaccine? Why isn't the vaccine being distributed throughout the country? You know, it's 1959, why are there 10,000 cases? You know, in the early 60s, the numbers were dropping down, but there were still, you know, in 1960 there were about 5,000 cases. So the fact that what we saw was this big spike in terms of age, you know, in the, like say 1990, and then over time the spike started to come down, and our average patient was 48, and then maybe, you know, 60 something, and now 58, is because we're seeing the people at the tail end of the curve, and nobody understands that. It didn't disappear April 12, 1955. A woman was interviewed in California where one of the outbreaks was. Both her mother and her brother died of polio. And she was interviewed because she's absolutely furious that people think that vaccines are sort of passé. Number one, there are no real diseases that you can catch anymore, so why do you need a vaccine against these things that don't exist? And the other is this notion that vaccines are dangerous because they either suppress your immune system, which doesn't make any sense because they activate your immune system by definition, or they give you autism, and that's the big deal in the U.S. And there's a case today going to court about the effect of mercury in the vaccines, which, and there is no mercury in the polio vaccine, and it's only in the flu vaccine, the kids' flu vaccine now. So it's very difficult to get people to pay attention to something that isn't an imminent threat. When the bird flu came out, you know, I wrote an editorial about, you know, the bird flu is a clear but not a present danger. You know, there are, you know, X number of cases, 10 people had died, and polio is rampant in Nigeria, in India, in Pakistan, in Afghanistan. It at that time was in 10 countries that had been polio free. Somebody gets on a plane in Pakistan, comes to New York, comes to Melbourne, goes and visits their cousin, who's 4 years old or 3 years old or whatever, has no symptoms themselves, and excretes the virus, and all of a sudden we've got a dozen polio cases. One thing people don't realize is that 70% of individuals infected with the polio virus have no symptoms at all. So it's like typhoid Mary. Now, does anybody know who typhoid Mary was? No. So we're kind of stuck. You know, we've got this horrendous disease that is paralyzing and killing people through Africa and the subcontinent, and, you know, through Asia, and here everything is fine. You know, we don't have to worry about tsunamis. You know, they have to worry about tsunamis. We don't have to worry about volcanoes. They have to worry about volcanoes. Well, you know what? We damn well better worry about polio and these other diseases that are being imported. With the measles outbreak, you know, what percentage of kids in the United States will die from measles? Well, probably none. You know, maybe one out of an outbreak, a huge outbreak of measles. Why would you want one kid to die? When we were using the oral polio vaccine, which is a much more effective vaccine for a variety of reasons than the injectable vaccine, about 8 kids a year would get paralytic polio. And there was huge outcry. You know, one child out of 2.25 million kids who got the polio vaccine would get paralytic polio. Well, that ratio is not terribly bad unless your child is one of the 8 who gets polio. So, oh no, you know, we can't have that. You know, that's understandable. You know, the thing that makes me nuts too is, you know, you said in Melbourne, they'll interview the health officials or the school officials, and they'll say, oh, well, we have 93% coverage in school, or New York City has 96% coverage in school. Well, that sounds really good. The United States has about 91% coverage of children, of infants and toddlers, up to 36 months. 90% coverage. Sounds good. That leaves 1 million infants and toddlers unvaccinated against polio. Here we're sitting in New Jersey. New York City is across the river. There are more than 50,000 infants and toddlers in New York and New Jersey unvaccinated against polio. So our friend from Pakistan lands at Newark Airport, lands at JFK, goes and visits their 18-month-old cousin who may be poor and has not been vaccinated, and all of a sudden there's a dozen cases of paralytic polio. So these percentages are dangerous because they talk about school-age kids, and it's 96%. Well, we're 4% shy, but okay, I'll give you the 4%. When you start talking about 1 million American children unvaccinated, that's ridiculous. There's no